As simple as my use of ISO? ISO. I'm going to stick with ISO. As simple as my use of ISO is, it's amazing how complex the setting or process is and how difficult it might be to explain. In fact, much of the nuance of what I say in this video might technically not be exactly right, but even the most accurate technician would at least be challenged to explain all that's going on with simplicity, clarity, and technical precision. Now, what you need to know is that ISO affects how sensitive the sensor or image is to light. Your camera needs a certain number of particles or waves of particles of light, not to get into that whole scientific theory, to hit the sensor to achieve a certain exposure. When you change the ISO, you are modifying the electrical signal, which in turn changes the sensor's sensitivity to light, changing how much light you need to achieve a certain exposure. That probably made no sense. Let's go at it this way. The more sensitive the pixel is to light, the less light it takes to achieve a specific exposure or brightness. Think of it like a trigger mechanism on something. The more sensitive the trigger is, the less pressure it takes to release the chain reaction. Same here. The more sensitive the pixel, the less light it takes to brighten that pixel. Now, because digital cameras are electrical and all of their components, such as the sensor, circuit board, etc., are electrical, there's lots of electrical signals coursing through it. These signals have electromagnetic pulses, and when crammed closely together, they can interfere with one another a little. This interference creates what we call noise to the image. Pause a moment for an analogy. Think about sound. Whenever you record sound, you will have a certain amount of static or white noise that is inevitably being pumped through the signal. So if I'm to stop talking right now and boost the gain of the audio, you'll hear that noise. If I was to move myself away from my microphone and try talking, you'd also hear more of that noise. The fact is, that noise is always there no matter what, but when I speak closely to my mics and have all of my levels balanced, you aren't able to hear any of that. When there is not enough sound to exceed the level of that white noise, or when I boost the overall gain of the audio signal, you will begin to hear that noise. Well, the same thing happens to image noise with ISO. Because of all the electrical signals in a digital camera that create a certain amount of interference and noise, there is always going to be visual noise in the image that shows up on the sensor, this part down here. When there's not enough light on a particular pixel to expose something more than that noise, the noise shows up. Think of light like sound in this analogy. The more light, the louder the sound. When you remove the sound, you hear the static. When you remove light, you see the noise. So the noise is going to show up in the dark parts of the image. There's not enough light hitting the shadows to overcome the noise that's there. ISO affects the overall gain of the image, making it more or less sensitive to light. When you increase the gain on a microphone, you're making it more and more sensitive to all sound. Now it will pick up the quietest sound, but this includes white noise. When you increase the gain of the ISO, you are doing the same thing. It's boosting the electrical signal of everything, making the sensor more sensitive to light. Now the smallest amount of light will suddenly brighten a pixel or get it to a specific exposure that it wouldn't if it wasn't so sensitive. But it does this across the light spectrum, including the noise that's already there. So when you boost the ISO, you're going to expose more noise in your shadows where there's not enough light to expose something more than that noise. When I put the lens cap on my lens and record at ISO 850 and then change it to 5000, you can't tell much of a difference. But if I was to boost the exposure in post all the way up, suddenly you see that noise like crazy. The 850 image is comparatively clean while the 5000 is blotchy. So what ISO should you set your camera to? The lowest ISO possible? Well, I always start with the base ISO of a camera. The base ISO will be different for each camera, and no, base doesn't mean the lowest ISO your camera is capable of filming at. The base ISO is the ISO level that has the perfect blend of the least amount of noise in the signal but the most amount of dynamic range. The lowest ISO will technically get you the least amount of noise in your image, but at a certain point you begin crushing the shadows at each additional drop in ISO so much that you lose the number of distinguishable stops of light below middle gray. The base ISO is the best balance between the two. This is why I always shoot at base ISO. It's the cleanest image with the most dynamic range and the easiest to expose properly. In fact, in the dozen years I've been a professional videographer, I've probably shot out of base ISO only literally a handful of times. Why would you want to? Well, again, increasing ISO does help your camera to be more sensitive to light, allowing it to see objects when less light is present. So say you're shooting a run and gun documentary on the streets live, you have no light kit with you, it's nighttime, and you're trying to capture a really important moment of your story. Your aperture is wide open, you don't want to have crazy motion blur by changing your shutter speed, so what do? You boost that ISO. Get all of those pixels more sensitive to light, allowing them to reach proper exposure with less light because you have less light available to you. Yes, your image will be more noisy and perhaps ugly, but it's better than having a pitch black image that you can't see anything or not getting it at all. And depending how much you have to increase the ISO, you may not even notice the additional noise. One more thing to note, it actually takes a lot of light to light a really good dark scene. Why is this? Well, think about what we just learned about noise in the shadows with high ISO. If we were to film a shot at night in this room and try to make it look dark, we could simply turn off all the lights except one, put it at 1%, open the aperture, and crank up the ISO. Here's the result. Looks pretty cheap, doesn't it? Why? Because cinematography is painting with light, and we've eliminated light. Also because we've increased the noise everywhere. So what happens if we do the inverse of what we'd naturally think? Let's put the ISO at the base for a nice clean image. Let's blast a light on the background and on the subject, and then increase the ND. We maintain the same ratio of contrast on the subject's face and between the subject and the background, but we pump the set with light. By darkening the image with ND, we can achieve that dark effect. But now we have a much cleaner and more moody image. When we boost the exposure on both, you can see how much more noisy the intuitive setup is, and that's no good. If you watch a lot of behind-the-scenes videos for big Hollywood films, you'll start to notice just how much light they fill sets of dark scenes. It seems like it almost takes more light to light a clean, quality dark scene than a bright one, and it all comes down to ISO. Gain and image noise. Well, I hope this video was helpful because though I won't be seeing you in the next one, you're sure to see me rough.